I am Mike Sulhoff, and I do teach at Black Hills State and two other universities in Georgia, online, but in real time. I found my passion for economics in 2007 and 8 when I owned a company that actually installed metal roofs on residential and commercial applications, and I started noticing for sale signs everywhere. Houses were being sold right and left, and I didn't know what I was looking at, but I realized that there was something wrong with it. And I started to do some research, and right before the crash, I actually sold my own company to my own board of directors, who for some reason decided that was a good idea, and began liquidating my assets, and sure enough, everything fell apart, as everybody remembers. I was very interested in what happened. I was curious, because to me the most important question anybody can ever ask is why? Why is the first question you've got to ask, and we don't ask that question very often anymore. We just take everything at face value. By the way, I talk real fast. I'm not Ben Shapiro, but I would like to grow up and be just like him. We ask why. We need to ask why. We don't ask why often enough. And the follow-up question we never ask is, and then what? Right? And that's the economic follow-up question. We take things at face value too readily, and we don't pursue the results of what we do, the unintended consequences of policies that we make or decisions that we make far enough down the road to find out what happens. And so we ask, maybe sometimes we ask why, but we walk away with that answer and don't consider it anymore. What we need to continue asking is, and then what? Okay, and then what? Okay, and then what? And as long as we keep asking, and then what, someone will be forced to give us an answer. And the problem is we're not taking them down that path where they're forced to be intellectually honest with us regarding the policies that they're enacting and the ideas they're expecting us to take prima facie, face value, basically because they said so, just like our parents did when we were 4. We're not 4, but in many times, unfortunately, we're acting like it. So I've been watching very carefully what's happened, not just in the United States, but globally, from a socioeconomic perspective for 2.5 years now. I mean, I've always been somewhat of a student of news, but lately everything seems to matter more. I address students every single day in a collegiate platform, and I'm teaching them to start wondering why. And it's been a very conducive environment for me to take lessons out of a book and apply them directly to real life, because things are happening fast and they're happening in very real ways. Principles and theories that are contained within the textbooks are coming to life every day in the real world. So I'm able to use this as a platform to explain to them the concepts, and not only the concepts, but how they apply to what we're watching right now. So what I wanted to, actually, the model that I've drawn just came to me as I was sitting in my office, and I started putting a bunch of things together and connecting a bunch of dots regarding some things that we'll talk about tonight and next week, if you're patient enough to bear with me 2 whole weeks. But I haven't seen this anywhere else. And I feel like maybe it's something that needs to be shared, and I'm sincerely going to, once we establish a framework upon which we hang all this, get your thoughts on possibly some of the things that I've suggested, maybe in the works, and things we can expect as a result of things that are in the works. So what I would like to do is take this week, what time we have left, and create. I don't know what your backgrounds are. I don't know how much economic learning experience you've had. I'm sure many of you are business people working in a microeconomic environment. Macroeconomic environments are very different, but they're all economics. And let's face it, everything's economics. Everything's economics. It's what makes it's what gives me the passion for economics. When I understand that economics is not just about money. In fact, most of the time, money is the last thing economics is all about. Economics is about trade-offs. Economics is about scarcity. There not being enough of anything and us trying to figure out ways to get what we need. Economics involves everything from trading a pair of skates for a skateboard to trading affection with somebody who brings some fulfillment to your life in a way that adds to you and you add to them. These are all economic questions and issues. And once I began to realize that economics essentially described the physics of human behavior, it really came alive. And so what I want to show you is basically the framework upon, like I said, which we're going to hang my theory and my understanding of where we are right now. But again, I don't know what your backgrounds are. So I'm going to make a type 2 error, that is to assume it isn't when it is, and go ahead and just start really simple about some basic macroeconomic principles. Please do not be insulted if you know all this or if you could come up and teach it better than me. I bet that's the case. But I've done this a bunch of times, and I've kind of got it down to a pretty quick science. Essentially, in the time we've got, I'd like to give you almost a semester's worth of macroeconomics in about an hour or less. And it's being videoed, so if you were inclined to take notes or have some way of, collecting the data in a way that you can retain it, I'm sure it'll be available to you in some other way, after tonight. But I'm going to start real basic with just some expressions and terms and phraseologies and vocabulary that I'm going to use a lot. Some of these words may be obvious to you, but in the context in which we're going to be describing these phenomena, I want them to be understood in the way that I'm going to be explaining them. First of all, economics itself, as I already said, nothing more than the science of scarcity and trade-offs. We all endure scarcity. As Robin Williams famously said, ever since the fall of man, things have been tough all over. That's why. There's scarcity. There wasn't scarcity before. Now there is. Economics is our struggle to deal with scarcity, taking what we have and making more with it. Not making more of it, but making more with it. That's economics. And it can be tangible and intangible. It can have to do with our relationships or our very sustenance. A market. The term market is a very specific word I use very frequently in my lectures, but essentially it exists whenever there is trade of any kind. And how many participants do you need to have trade? Two. That's it. Anytime there are two people voluntarily engaging in trade where both person ends up better off than they were before the trade occurred, you've got a market. And that's what a market is. Demand is what or is wanted or desired. Now, we know that, but it needs to be specified at a price for a time. Demand, it encapsulates the concepts of price and time. Both of those things change in terms of how they are represented by demand. Supply, of course, is the same thing. What is supplied or provided at a price for a time? When we talk about supply and demand, we're about to draw this on the board, a picture you've all seen a million times. When there is balance between supply and demand, we establish a magical principle that the universe is seeking everywhere it goes. Does anybody know what that's called?
Equilibrium.
Equilibrium. This is going to be great. This is going to be so easy. Okay, now this may be a foreign expression, but it's really important that we all understand this when I say it, because I'm going to say it a lot of times. Positive analysis. Positive analysis is essentially accepting a condition or a situation as it is, in situ, understanding that it is what it is because nature made it that way. It's observation. It's accepting the properties of a phenomenon or a circumstance or a condition or an arrangement as it is. That is to be contrasted dramatically with normative analysis. Normative analysis, I use this illustration when I'm talking to the students in the classroom. Normative analysis is if you walked out of a clearing in the woods and you see this valley, beautiful valley with a stream running down the middle of it, and up to the upper right there's a rise and there's a bevy of flowers and a little deer over here to your right, and there's a bunch of bunnies over there on the left of the stream, and there's tall grass, and there's maybe some sunflowers off to the far backside, and you stand there and you observe it. That would be your positive analysis of the meadow that you just stumbled across. Normative analysis is when you stumble across the meadow and you go, this is really nice, but I really think the creek should be flowing that way. And it might be better if the bunnies were over here and the deer were over there, and I don't like the flowers over there. I think they should probably be planted over here. What's the difference? We stumbled across the valley in situ, right? We observed this condition as it existed prior to any involvement by our presence or anyone else's. It was nature at its best. It was nature doing what nature did. Normative analysis is thinking essentially you can improve on nature, right? Dangerous waters in normative analysis. Unintended effects are the punchline of human existence. It's another expression that we use quite a lot in economics, unintended effects, which of course is where you mean one thing and you get something. You may get that thing, but you also get a lot of other things with it. The most famous example of unintended effects is called the Streisand Effect, where Barbara Streisand built a beautiful mansion in Malibu, and she didn't want anybody to see it or know what it looked like, so she made this public proclamation, don't anybody take any pictures of my house. I want no pictures taken of my property. Immediately there were boats and helicopters and planes and people climbing up, and it had the exact opposite effect of what she intended. So unintended effects are, of course, after, through normative analysis, you have made a proclamation that something is as it is, but it should be some other way, you're going to get a lot of other things that change too. There was a reason the bunnies were off to the left and the deers were off to the right. When we switch them, we find out, yeah, the bunnies are here now and the deer are over there, but there are going to be some unintended consequences to that decision through normative analysis. So we're starting to plug these words into a model that we're going to use quite a lot. Now, another differentiation I want to make is we conflate these words all the time. Value and price are two totally different things. Value never changes. Value is infinite. We value transportation, communication, affection, clothing, shelter, food, the same now as we did 10,000 years ago. The values of these things have never changed, but the prices change a lot, don't they? As we all well know right now. We value transportation now as much as Og the caveman did when he had his slab of granite and pulled around by a brontosaurus to get from point A to point B. It was important for him to get from point A to point B, just like it is for us to get from home to church. But the prices change dramatically. They sometimes go up, sometimes they go down. So the distinction to be made between value and prices, values never change, prices change quite often. Speaking of prices, and we're almost through the little vocab list, you're being very patient with me, I appreciate your forbearance. Price seeking versus price controlling. These are two other very important concepts that we understand, the dramatic contrast between the two. Price seeking is essentially when you come up with a new doolally and you know how much it costs you to make that doolally, and you want to find out if people want to buy doolollies, and so you put the doolally in the front yard and you see over a period of trials and errors by putting different prices on it and finding out the quantity of that which you are able to sell based on the price you put on it, you maximize the amount you can make and the number of them you can sell at some point. We magically call it equilibrium. That is price seeking. That is the market doing what it does. It is settling at equilibrium. It is at rest. The number of doolollies produced is exactly the number of doolollies demanded at this price. The price was determined after the fact. It was a result of letting nature run its course through economics. People trying to eliminate the scarcity in their life by making trades. The result is price discovery or price seeking. That is completely contrasted with a normative economic principle called price controlling. We all know what price controlling looks like. The most famous price controlling examples that present themselves in price floors and price ceilings, which I'll actually draw for you here in a second, is of course minimum wage, is a price control, the price of human labor, the price of someone's time. And another example of price controlling could be rent control, where you tell a landlord what they're allowed to charge for their own personal property. Both of these are normative economic examples of things that dramatically alter our equilibrium and always have unintended consequences. Okay, so all these words, any more? Oh, well, there is one more. You've probably never heard of this one. Inflation. Anybody heard of it? Is that in there? I can spell it if you want. But I do want to point this out, though, because this is an important distinction between what people think and what truly is regarding inflation. People tend to seek a definition of inflation through the understanding that prices go up. That is not a terribly pure nor organic version or definition of the word inflation. The best description of inflation is the value of your dollar goes down. The ability for you to trade with the same medium of exchange that you did prior to this point in time has decreased. So rather than use the word inflation to describe prices as going up, I tell all my students, don't think of inflation that way. That's the dead end. If you think of inflation from a perspective of this is basically the value of your dollar going down, you can go places with that. That takes you in all kinds of different directions that you can explore, because now we've attached inflation not to the value of something, but how much of that thing you can buy with what you have. What you have is a direct representation of your mind, your time, and your effort. So inflation has huge effects, not just on the cost of things, but what you put into your ability to obtain the things you need because of scarcity, through trade-offs, in an economic environment, in a market where you're voluntarily engaging in trade with other people. See how neat this works? Okay, well, if you can kind of hang on to some of those terms, and I'll use them a lot. You'll see them in context. So if you, and I'm sure, I think you'll probably have a pretty good idea what those meant. Anyway, okay, well, don't feel insulted if I go ahead and take you all the way back to a picture you've seen a million times. We're going to go a lot of places with this. Everybody's seen this a million times. And if you haven't, then let me go ahead and just spend a couple seconds and explain, first of all, where these lines come from. Because I'm sure even if you've seen it, you may not have parsed it enough to remember exactly why they're shaped like they are. Supply, oh, this is supply. This is a line that represents supply. Now, supply, because it is supply, will always go from the bottom left of your graph to the top right of your graph. And here's why. It has to do with reward, the reward of behavior. If you are one who is supplying, and the price that you're able to get for that which you are supplying is zero, how much of that are you going to supply? Zero, of course. So your price is zero. Since there's no reward in that engagement or that endeavor of supplying, you're going to go ahead and produce actually exactly zero of them. And that's where we get our first data point. Let's go ahead and be ridiculous on our second data point and say if you're given $1 million, Brazilian, quadrillion, and possibillion dollars per unit, are you more or less likely to produce some?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, right? So as the price goes up, the quantity goes up in a corresponding manner, and gives us another data point. Well, when you have two data points, you have a line. Pretty simple, right? So the slope of this supply line can vary, and that's a whole other concept called elasticity that we don't need to go near. But the point is, this supply line, and the line that represents supply, is literally made up of an infinite number of dots that all represent a ratio of price to quantity. And that infinite number of dots gives us supply. And so you can see why it always has to go from bottom left to top right. It has to. There's no other way. To do it any other way would suggest that you're more likely to supply if the price is zero and less likely to supply if the price is high, which of course is the exact opposite of human nature. Human nature being that of seeking reward and avoiding punishment. It's what we do. So that's why your supply line is always going to go from the bottom left to the top right. Similarly, your demand line is always going to go from top left to bottom right. Why? For the exact same reason. If the price is zero for something that you really desire, if you're like really into doolollies, are you going to want none of them or a lot of them?
Bunch.
Obviously, you're going to want a bunch. And so the price being zero, remember here we are. And here is our, it's off a little bit, but we're going to want a high quantity at $0. And as the price increases to $1 million, billion, quadrillion, and possibillion dollars per doolally, how many are you going to, look, if it's even $100, I can't buy one right now. My quantity will be zero. And so we get the other data point that creates the other end of our line, and that very simply, very quickly explains why the demand line always runs top left to bottom right, and the supply line always runs from bottom left to top right. Fair enough?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And they always, because if two lines aren't parallel, what do they inevitably do?
Intersect.
They intersect, and they intersect. the place that the supply and the demand line intersect is that magic place that we call equilibrium. And it is essentially saying that the quantity at that point gives us the price for that quantity based on the ability and reward of supplying and the ability and reward of demanding. And that's essentially the whole point of our supply and demand line. It doesn't literally, it gets no simpler than that. Now, it can get more complicated. And I want to spend a couple seconds talking about the importance of this force right here. Anybody remember Jurassic Park? Remember Malcolm? Jeff Goldblum? Coolest guy ever. I could just listen to him recite the phone book. He's so cool. He just, his voice, something about it. Anyway, you remember he talked about how they were saying, oh, we've made all the dinosaurs female, so we won't have any accidents. And he said, you're messing around with equilibrium, dude. That doesn't work. It never ends well, right? And of course he was right. We had velociraptors ripping people's heads off before the end of the movie. And that's the thing about equilibrium. Now I want to take a second and explain it. This was not invented, right? This didn't emerge from the fertile fruits of some genius's mind. Just like electricity wasn't invented, and gravity wasn't invented. Those are forces of the universe. This is no less a force of the universe. Maybe even stronger than gravity and electricity. What we did with gravity and electricity was we discovered them, right? Used their properties, used their strengths, leveraged them in order to enable us and make our lives better. This is exactly the same thing. We discovered that this is what happens when people engage in voluntary trade to their benefit with other people trying to eliminate scarcity. You get this brilliant model. Now the model is brilliant, but it wasn't invented. It was discovered. It was the result of understanding human behavior and how it works when we trade. Okay, so that means that this intersection here is an incredibly powerful force of nature. And when you try to move it, you get violent unintended consequences, as we're finding out right now. And at the end of next week, hopefully, at that point, I'll be able to flesh out for you the model that I have come up with explaining kind of where we are right now and why the violence is being pent up in a way that it will suddenly be released, I believe. And we will be forced to reckon with some of the normative economic choices we've been making over the past year and a half. It's happening very quickly. I mean, I've never seen it. I don't think anyone's ever seen anything like this. So I just wanted to point out the power behind the seeking of this intersection and what happens. Well, I'm going to show you what happens in a couple of places when we try to move it through, again, normative economics. Now, let me label this graph just a little bit. I want to define this area here as the market. Remember, it only takes two people, someone supplying and someone demanding, but it must be voluntary, and they both have to be trading up. Anytime that ever happens, again, even in interpersonal relationships, if we're talking about something we just need innately from another person, and we choose that person to surround ourselves with, there's a trade going on. We're both bringing something to the table. We're both supplying and fulfilling a demand. And that's going to give us an equilibrium, i.e. a quantity and a price for whatever it is we bring to that relationship. Were you going to?
If that is forced, you still have two people, let's say it's fuel.
Right.
You still have two people agreeing on getting a gallon of gas and selling a gallon of gas, even though they don't like the price. They need it.
Well, that's true. And need is, of course, an incredible force of nature, as you alluded to. And, there's another word I didn't put on my list of definitions, but aggregate. Aggregate is a real important word because what you're describing is the aggregate force of what we're going to call, well, aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which is totally different. Well, no. It's the same exact principle, but it's done en masse. It's done by a population and not just a minimum of 2 people participating in a could be a relatively small market of a simple trade between 2 people. When you're talking about the price of gas and our ability to buy it or our need to buy it, the equilibrium for the price of gas is established essentially the same way, but in aggregate. And in that case, we would have not our D here, we would have an A in front of it, and we wouldn't have an S up here, we would have a short-run aggregate supply here. But it's going to describe the same phenomenon, but in mass, with a multiple, like with an entire population like you're describing.
So what I mentioned really doesn't matter or even exist with what you're talking about. It's totally different.
It's totally different when we're talking about 2 individuals versus an entire market that involves millions of individuals. Because when we go from 2 individuals or a relatively small number of individuals who are able to negotiate and deal with the quantity and the price like almost on a one-on-one basis, that's one thing. That's establishing the equilibrium. Our equilibrium, when we're talking about the price of gas at this point, unless there are normative economics thrown in there, and there are, and as a matter of fact, there's gas taxes, for example, that are normative. And let me go ahead and draw the big arrow, the evil arrow coming in from outside the market, exerting forces, normative forces, that are hell-bent on moving this equilibrium somewhere other than where nature has chosen it to be. And of course, you're right. In the gasoline market, for example, there are all kinds of normative pressures being applied to equilibrium in gasoline. Who knows what gasoline would be if it were simply a result of the demand for gasoline and the ability of people to supply gasoline. But oh my goodness, the forces coming against this equilibrium right here, just on gasoline alone. I mean, forget taxes. What about shutting down pipelines? I'm just saying. Right? And in that case, by the way, and I'm getting way ahead of well, thanks. You're through your forces, your normative forces. Now you're actually forcing quantity, right? Usually normative forces come in the form of price controls, where you have a price floor and a price ceiling. And they do their thing to equilibrium, which I'll actually show you in a second. But since you're just way ahead of us, thank you. Again, we change now through normative forces. We changed quantity, okay? And now we divided our equilibrium up into 2 disparate, very, very unstable parts, right? And actually, you're like in the next semester. But what we just did now was we created this area right here called dead weight loss. Okay? And nobody benefits from here. Now, the taxes or the benefits that the powers that be gleaned from shutting down an entire pipeline, there may be benefits to a select number of people through that. There may be select benefits to the government if they're taxing gasoline, for example. And what I actually, this very day, today in my classes at Black Hill State, describe as the problem here is you've got to decide whether the benefits of those taxes and the unintended consequences of shutting down entire pipelines are greater than the loss experienced right here, right? Regardless, oh man, I'm going way around my elbow to get to my earlobe. But what we got here, essentially, is with this dead weight loss, we split this stable point in equilibrium now to these 2 disparate, unstable points. And what's going to happen inevitably, remember I said, equilibrium is mean. It is not a friendly force. And if you get in its way, it will mow you down. So what we'll have then is aggregate demand. We haven't even talked about aggregate demand yet. Will shift. It will follow equilibrium. And you will get really serious unintended consequences. Especially when short-run aggregate supply tries to keep up with its equilibrium shift. Now, you've got a completely different quantity at the same price point, and now the dead weight loss is that big. Now, tell me shutting down pipelines and charging a certain degree of taxes per gallon of gas, we'd have to enumerate it, of course, but the calculation, I guarantee you, is going to show you that this is far greater loss than the benefit gleaned from the normative forces being placed on a natural equilibrium. Okay? So far, so good? Because that was, I mean, really great question. I wasn't even going to talk about moving through normative analysis quantities. But, I mean, that's a very real, another time this happened, recently.
So when that happens, Mike, that's a great place to say why. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I haven't even got past why yet before I can even go to it, and then what? I mean, if I said why, and a particular speech challenged president said because, then I would say, and then what? And I guarantee you, the answer is not one we would any of us like to hear.
No.
I believe in this particular example, the and then what was, well, then you're just going to have to stop using gasoline. Or you're just going to have to stop eating meat.
Yes.
Right? Okay. So you're going to have, how about leaders, I'm getting so far ahead of myself, of our country saying aloud, lower your expectations. Those are actual words that they're saying out loud now. I don't remember a political climate where the politicians said, don't expect so much. What are they usually saying? Vote for me and I'll give you this, that, and the other thing. No. Janet Yellen, former chair of the Federal Reserve and current Treasury Secretary, 2 weeks ago said, stop expecting so much. Innately, that's a horrifying thing to hear.
Why now is not why did it happen, but why did they do it?
That's the thing, and that's kind of next week.
Sorry.
Hold your horses.
I didn't mean to do that.
No, well, yeah, you did, but that's okay. So anyway, all right, well, let me do this. Okay, the market, this is the market. The market is everything that encapsulates, okay, this supply and demand chart. Forget all the extra lines. If you just grant me the not having to erase all that. That means that everything outside the squiggly line is outside the market, which means it's not a natural part of this voluntary trade arrived at by individuals trying to eliminate scarcity by trading up. Okay, anytime anything from outside the squiggly line tries to influence this, they don't have a dog in the hunt, right? Anything outside the squiggly line does not have a dog in the hunt. So why? And every time you see a force applying itself to a free market through normative analysis, you've got to ask why. Because the answer will have nothing to do with the health of this market.
Right. Pure politics.
It's pure politics. And a very common example is minimum wage, if it's $7.50 an hour. Okay? Because the market determined that for this quantity of hours, an individual should be paid on average. Forget the fact that there probably shouldn't be such a thing as minimum wage. We've had $7.50 for so long, it's part of the market at this point. Okay? So just for purposes of our conversation, we gotta just go with what we're given. Okay? But now we're talking about what? 15 now? You know, not just for LA and New York, but Rapid City too, which could clearly afford $15 an hour for every employee, whether they're flipping burgers or designing rocket engines. Okay, so when you do this through normative analysis, now you've created a new price point where it crosses our supply and demand at 2 points that are not this point, right?
Right.
Here we have our equilibrium that was determined at $7.50 an hour, established and adopted. By the way, $7.50 an hour didn't stick. People were paying people more than $7.50 an hour long before the 15 now folks ever came along.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Positive analysis, the market being allowed to determine for itself what an hour's labor was worth, whether it be Cleveland, Georgia, Rapid City, South Dakota, New York, or LA, which are completely, clearly different economies, right? We're doing it all by themselves, right? But no, we had people who didn't have dogs in the fight. You name one politician that's ever worked for $7.50 an hour, have no interest whatsoever in establishing any kind of balance in here, came along and said, no, 15 now. Not 15 in 10 years, 15 now. What kind of shock does that place on an economy? Well, ironically, when it draws the line way up here, that's called a price floor, which means this low and no lower, right? Well, look what we just did. We took our stable atom of a equilibrium, broke it into two disparate, unstable components of an atom, and now we have this gap, don't we? The quantity supplied, let's call this, well, we'll call it Q1 down here, versus the quantity demanded. Is this more than that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Because more is more than less, right? Usually. More is more than less. And so that means that the quantity of labor here supplied is far greater now than the quantity of labor demanded, right? Because that's our demand line, that's our supply line. We've got this nice big gap now. And when you, through normative economics, artificially establish a price for an hour of labor, you obviously get a surplus of labor. That is, more is supplied than is demanded. And we have a word for that. Of course. That is the result of normative economics. But wait, there's more. Remember, equilibrium is going to have its way. And if you get in your way, you're going to get boned. In its way, you're going to get boned down. How do we deal with artificial price floors? We raise the price of a Big Mac to the point where the person flipping the Big Mac soon can't buy one, even with their raise, right? We hire robots. Heck with you guys. You take smoke breaks, you don't show up half the time, we can fix that, and we are fixing that. Self-checkout. We both argue that we ought to be paid by Walmart.
Yep.
We should be on the payroll.
Amen.
I mean, the quality of the burger is going to go. Look, that money's going to come. You all know this. I don't have to tell you. I have to tell my students that small business owners aren't rich. Just aren't. You know, and I even have to tell them McDonald's isn't sitting on this big pile of cash they just don't want to give to their employees. You know how I know this? Because there's a thing called Burger King. Right? And McDonald's has got to cut as much as it possibly can to still make a profit, and you want them to make a profit if you want McDonald's is around, right? Just enough to keep people from going to Burger King, and they don't have piles of cash, as you well know, sitting around to give this to their, so they're going to cut back on the quality of the burgers, they're going to hire robots instead of employees, they're going to fire people and make the remaining employees work harder and longer, okay? It's equilibrium having its way, and the unintended consequences are disastrous. So, and we can do the same thing with price ceilings and rent control, and I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on that, because I think you have a pretty good understanding of all that. Okay, so let me now make it quick, because I jumped ahead of this, and I want to revisit it very quickly, because it's going to come into play as I create this framework that we're going to hang everything else off of. When I was a student and I had a teacher erasing a whiteboard if they missed a little spot, like that. How many of you are just sitting there dying to run up here? I know there's at least half of you. Dying 1,000 deaths. Get it! That's staying there. No, I got it. Oh, jeez, I don't know what happened there. Anyway, okay. I don't know if I can live with that.
Put some spit on it.
I know. Anybody seen Dune?
Yeah.
Cool movie. But that spit's very valuable in Dune. I don't think I can spare it. Okay. Okay, here we have our supply. Here we have our demand. Well, actually, I'm going to do supply here too. And down here, I'm going to draw demand. And then this nebulous weird thing over here. Because this is an important distinction to make. This now, I'm going to call this something different. I'm going to call this now quantity supply. And there's an important reason for making this distinction. And I'm going to call this quantity demanded. Now this essentially refers to the quantity, per price. Now, that is not to be mistaken for supply and demand. which means quantity at a price. Okay? These lines, as I just showed you, are made up of an infinite number of dots. Each dot represents a quantity per price. Each quantity has its corresponding price. Each price has its corresponding quantity, right? That's how we got the lines in the first place, both in supply and demand. Over here now, you'll notice that these lines can and possibly do move right to left along the quantity line, not the price line. Sometimes you'll find textbooks that like to draw these up and down, like it's really confusing, because when they shift the demand line, the other one will be up like this. And it's such an exercise of utility and nonsensical, because if you just were to continue these lines all the way down and all the way up, you get the exact same thing I just proved, which I don't understand why they do that, because it just confuses things. So they always move right to left, but that's the difference I want you to understand. When we're talking about quantity supplied and quantity demanded, we're talking about the individual lines themselves and the components of price and quantity that made the line itself. When we're talking about supply and demand, we're talking about the line as a whole, as a unit, as a force of nature that is moved, doesn't move, it is moved right or left, depending on environmental conditions. By environmental, I'm not talking about rain and snow, I'm talking about all the things that can influence whether people want more or less of stuff, or people can supply more or less of stuff. All right, the reason this distinction is so important is because this is what we're messing with right now. Okay, we're not doing anything to this. We still want the same stuff for the same price. What's happening is how much of it we want and how much of it we're supplying. And if you're picking up what I'm putting down, you may see where I'm going to go next week.
Yep.
Because lines are moving violently right now.
Yeah.
And for the most nefarious reasons.
Nefarious.
Okay? Like, this is not wholesome. This is not productive in any possible way. There's no imagination that can put a spin on this that's positive in any way. And I got to see so many data points that were disparate and not connected that, like I said, I sat down at my desk the other day and I started just drawing. And I think I figured out what they're doing. So, Eric did that, got through that. I'm going to do that, I'm not going to do that. Let's do that, let's go. Okay, what do we got? Okay, we good with that, everybody? Because it's a very important distinction that I want you to make. Because from now on, we're really not going to talk a whole lot about quantity supply and quantity demand. We're going to talk about supply and demand, and then we're going to put a few other little twists into these concepts that aren't complicated, but very important, very salient in terms of understanding what's going on. So I just wanted to make that distinction, doing a great job of erasing, I would like to point out. I haven't missed it. So let's talk about, I can't do that. Okay. Let's go ahead and do this again now. I'm gonna use slightly different labels, and I'm gonna bring one more thing in. By the way, are you just being nice, or is any of this at all informative?
And we're just being nice.
I know you are, but I'm hoping that you're not just indulging me. I mean, if I just am trying to bring everybody up to speed, like I said, I want to create a framework that I can hang everything on, and I need everybody to be on the same. We're good?
I think you've given some hints about where.
I'm sure I'm not good at hiding my hand. Okay. So let's go ahead now and let's look at our familiar supply and demand graph. But now let's talk about, rather than demand, we're going to now talk only about aggregate demand. What does that mean? Obviously, that is the aggregate of all the demand for all the stuff, right?
Total.
The total amount of demand in an economy, in an entire economy now. We're not talking about a market anymore. Well, everything's a market. But right now, with regard to our drawing right now, we're talking about the entire economy. So aggregate, as you know, means essentially the collection of what would normally be disparate components. Unlike one another, we pool them all together, and now we have the aggregate of all the stuff. And here we have the aggregate of all the demand in the economy. Now, I know you would probably think that now I'm going to put aggregate supply, but I'm not. I'm going to throw a little wrench in the work, and I'm going to do SRAS. Now, that obviously stands for aggregate supply. The SR stands for short, run. Now, that is to be, that's distinctly different from long run aggregate supply, which is this vertical line with this beautiful nexus right here. Nature is seeking its balance. And here's a very happy economy. Now, the distinction between long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply, this moves quite frequently. This can move by the hour. It can certainly move by the day, the week, the month, and the year. Short-run aggregate supply can move to the left or to the right based on a number of environmental conditions. They could be weather-related. It could be geopolitical forces that change long-run or short-run aggregate supply. It could have to do with energy prices. It could have to do with availability, of labor, maybe. Supply chain issues could possibly be represented by a movement in short-run aggregate supply. Ever heard of it? Okay. Similarly, aggregate demand. The demand for everything can move to the right or to the left, again, based on natural environmental conditions. And by natural, I'm talking about humans just doing what humans do. If we all feel like we got a little more money in our pocketbooks or our wallets, we're going to increase aggregate demand as a whole, as an entire economy. If we feel like things are getting a little tight, we're going to push aggregate demand off to the left a little bit, because remember, that's quantity. And that's the point. Now, long-run aggregate supply doesn't move very much. Don't forget this. This is really important next week. Long-run aggregate supply is fairly stable. It's represented by a little thing called GDP, right? Okay. So, GDP is not enough to describe all the features related to long-run aggregate supply. By the way, the reason long-run aggregate supply is essentially a vertical line is it covers everything essentially from a stick of gum to a new F-350, which is what, $110,000?
No.
I can't buy one. I'll tell you that much. Platinum. Yeah. Okay, so the price points of everything in the environment, the economic environment, are represented, and that's why it's a vertical line. Every price point is represented because it's all the stuff, right? So now what we're talking about, when we're talking about GDP, everybody knows what that stands for. Gross, that means all of it. Domestic, here at home, product, right? Everything we produced, right? So everything we produce domestically, the gross total of that is the long-run aggregate supply, but that's not quite enough. GDP alone as a number is meaningless. How about this? Let's talk about your paycheck. Let's talk about income. Why do we work? We work in order to make money. Why do we make money? We make money in order to buy things.
Exchange for
Right? That's the whole point. That's why we work. We trade our minds, our physical effort, and our time, essentially, just to get stuff that we need, to reduce the scarcity, to engage in voluntary trade in order to care for our needs. And so we do this work and we get paid for it, but what is the point of the number on your paycheck that tells you how much you made that month if you don't know what you can trade it for? So the reality of the number on your paycheck is vitally important. And you only know if you really have gotten a raise or not if that number changes in a certain respect with regard to how much things cost. Well, a little sneak preview right now. Everybody's getting raises all over the country, but inflation's going up higher. The value of the dollar that they're being paid more of is decreasing faster than the increase in the pay. Okay, that's just a little fast forward to next week, because that all plays into this thing, right? Okay, so we're going to put an R here. That stands for real, because GDP is just the exact same thing as the number on your paycheck. It's meaningless unless you can compare it to another number on another paycheck to find out if you've made more between then and now or less. And when we compare, of course, the number on your paycheck to basically are the basket of goods that they determine what the cost of living is, right? How much it costs to actually buy stuff you need. When we're talking about GDP, the number representing the gross domestic product is pointless unless we understand that it's been compared to another baseline gross domestic product number. Then we can compare them and find out if this is actually an improvement or a degradation of the integrity of this number. So when we put the R in front of real GDP, we're talking now about real GDP, which is essentially this year's gross domestic product compared to any other year at any other time. That then gives us the reality of now, right? Because other than that, it's just what we call a nominative number. It's a number that just gives a name to something. And it's pointless unless it's compared to another number that gives it its reality. Well, there's one more number that has to be in here, and it's N. The N stands for natural. And natural refers to unemployment. So, most people know that unemployment, full employment, is generally considered around 5.5%, at least in this country, based on the model that we've enjoyed for over 100 years. Things are changing dramatically very quickly right now. But our economy, over time, has been tuned to absorb about 5% unemployment. It's like resistance on an exhaust system of your engine. It needs a little bit of that now in order to operate at peak efficiency. We count on it. It's part of our model. And so, this vertical line represents long-run aggregate supply under natural real GDP. They're essentially the same thing. But it's very stable. It moves seldom, and when it does move, it moves very little. And this is essentially the state of the economy at any given time. Now, we talk about aggregate demand shifting and short-run aggregate supply shifting quite frequently, and that's where our problems start. Although this time is different. We've all seen aggregate demand shift, and we've all seen short-run aggregate supply shift, but I don't think any one of us alive in this room right now has ever seen all three lines shift at one time.
Right.
No. So, stand by for more. Okay, as Paul Harvey would have said. The GDP, RGC, income, real income, monetary. Okay, real quick. I know I'm borrowing time at this point. There are two real points of fiscal responsibility. There's the monetary, and there is the fiscal. These are the facets of how the currency works in our country, in our economy. Monetary is under the purview of, everybody say it with me all at one time. No, worse than that.
Reserve. Oh, boy.
Which, as you probably all know, is neither federal nor a reserve.
Right.
It's neither of those things, right? You understand? That's just a name. It has nothing to do with reality. Okay? And the fiscal, of course, is the federal, as you said earlier, government. Okay? And here we're talking about their responsibility is really only two things. Monetary supply, and one more thing, you all probably know this, interest rates. Okay? And from the fiscal, we all know, all together now, taxing and spending. Okay. So, understand that, again, like I said, I'm building a frame. I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page when I talk about how this all fits together next week. I just want everybody to know what I'm talking about when I talk about Federal Reserve. What I talk about when I'm talking about interest rates and monetary supply. Now, let's really quickly, in the few minutes we have left, tie together all this and all this under the, well, it's a description of what I call the Great Debate. And some of you know what the Great Debate consists of and who its proponents are. If you have time, I strongly recommend YouTubing. I don't like YouTube, but it's really, I don't think you can get it on Rumble. So, YouTube, Keynes versus Hayek, fight of the century. When you get home or at some point, look this up. You've never been so thoroughly entertained in your life. It is truly.
Spell Keynes.
Keynes. I'll spell it right in a second. I'm going to do it right now. All right, great debate. Here's where we are right now, at a level that I never thought possible. I saw a little of it pop its head up after almost 100 years in 2008. But right now, this is everything. This is for all the marbles. This is where the rubber hits the road, this debate right now. And one side's going to win, and I think we all know which side it's going to be. As soon as I just flesh these out for you, you'll understand. This is called, best described as, supply side economics. In contrast, this is called demand side econ. Believe it or not, Keynes was a big fan of Hayek. Very quickly, the great Sir Maynard Keynes showed up in the middle of the Great Depression. And he was a proponent and an adherent to supply-side economics and Hayek and Say and Austrian economics and traditionally known as classical economics, which is what we've talked about all night. We've talked about economics being something we discovered and can leverage to our benefit. As long as we don't mess with it too much and just let it do its thing, like gravity and electricity. I mean, if electricity gets out, it hurts. So you got to control it to some degree. If you're going to use it, you're responsible for controlling it. Same thing with economics in a natural economic environment. Keynes believed all this, but he also saw an opportunity in the middle of the Great Depression to possibly leverage the worst of human proclivities, the worst of humans' tendencies, and that is our lack of patience. Because it all comes down to time, as we'll see. Hayek is based on production. Keynes is based on need. This is a lot. I always have to look this up. I'm not French.
Laissez-faire, hands off.
Laissez-faire, wait, there's more. Bottom up. Organic approach to economics. And Keynesianism seeks, it's not as easy when you're up here to spell, believe it or not. Seeks control of markets. Hayek embraced positive analysis. Leave the bunnies alone. They are there for a reason. The deer is on the right for a reason. Nature picked that for a reason. This then, of course, requires normative economics. Sorry. Let's move everything around. Make analysis. And this is probably the most salient of all the descriptors that I kind of made up. I've never seen it written anywhere, but I think it very well describes the almost spiritual difference between these two approaches. We are drawn towards supply side, and we are pushed towards demand side. Okay. If we're all on the same page still, and you picked up what I put down, next week I will connect all the dots and I will show you, I think, what this looks like on a whiteboard. Where we are, taking into account the few vocabulary terms that we've shared, and agreed upon the definitions of. I didn't teach you anything. I just wanted us to all agree, right? And the tendencies of certain portions of an economy to move in certain ways, naturally and unnaturally. And I want you to understand that this is where the rubber hits the road. These two schools of thought, and there's very strong reasons why this is the favored method by politicians of running an economy.
All politicians?
Pretty much. I don't know many, well, there might be a couple that understand the long-term value of allowing an economy to remain a natural phenomenon in the universe rather than trying to direct it for short-term gain. But that's where and then what is never asked, right? See, you can ask why, and they'll tell you, well, because there are people in need. Why? Well, because it's taking too long. Why? Well, because we have to boost aggregate demand. Why? You can they got answers for all these questions. The answer they cannot give you is the and then what. And then what dies here, like 2 questions in. And then what goes on forever over here. But the big difference is time. And that's where Keynes leverages the absolute basest nature of humanity, is our impatience, our inability to ask them what, and deal with the answer. And that's where we are right now. The base nature of humanity is being exploited and leveraged in a way that I don't think, at least in the history of this country, has ever been seen before. And I've got some thoughts on what the results of that will be. But I can give you a very, I think, really cool, very timely, very accurate graphic description based on everything we just talked about in one big picture next week. That's all I got for you tonight.